Hello, students. In this lesson, we're going to finish the events leading up to the American Revolution. As you've seen in previous lessons, the aftermath of the French and Indian War caused tensions to arise between the colonists in the 13 colonies and the British government. In large part, it had to do with the British government's attempts to pay off the war debt from the French and Indian War by taxing the colonies. The most infamous example of this was the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765 and was a tax on all printed materials in the colonies. And this was followed by the Townshend Acts in 1767, which was a tax on all imported goods such as lead, paint, glass, tea, and so on. Eventually, the Townshend Acts are repealed. Now, by this point in time, the colonists have noticed a pattern. The colonists had responded to the Stamp Act by boycotting British goods, and the Stamp Act had been repealed. The colonists responded to the Townshend Acts by boycotting British goods, and the Townshend Acts had been repealed. Except for one. All of the Townshend Acts were repealed except for the tax on tea. And so the colonists responded to the tax on tea the same way they had responded to the Stamp Act and the other Townshend Acts. They boycotted British tea. They simply refused to buy any tea coming from Great Britain. They either used tea that had been smuggled in from other countries, or they made their own tea. By 1773, the British Parliament decided that it was going to try to resolve this issue. Now, remember what the cause of all these protests are. Why do the colonists have a problem with the British taxing them? Because they don't have representation in Parliament. Remember, Parliament is the lawmaking body of Great Britain. The people actually living in Great Britain get to elect representatives who go to Parliament and make laws. However, there are no representatives in Parliament from the colonies. And so the colonists are frustrated because they're being taxed without representation. In 1773, Parliament passes a new tax. This is known as the Tea Act. And the Tea Act actually lowers the tax on tea. It also states that, or that should be lowered, it says lowered, but it also states that the colonists must buy tea from the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company was a pretty big deal, and it was a huge source of income for the British government. But by 1773, it was starting to go broke. And so Parliament decided that it would help the company out. It told the company that we will give you the exclusive right to sell tea to the colonists. They will not be able to buy tea from anybody else except you. The catch is you have to sell it for cheap. And what the colonists, or what Parliament is hoping will happen, is the colonists will look at the tax and will decide that it's not worth protesting over. It's not much. It's maybe 3 pence per pound, or as we would say, 3 cents per pound. It's literally cheaper to buy the tea legally than to smuggle it in from another country. But Parliament is missing the point. The colonists are not upset about the price of the taxes. The colonists are upset because they're being taxed without representation. They have no way of voting yes or no against these taxes. And so it is agreed that they will continue to boycott British tea. And all across the colonies, you see East India ships arriving in the colonies, loaded with tea, and being turned back. In many cases, the colonists will not even allow the ships to unload the tea. You see this happen in New York. A East India Company ship arrives in New York. There's a crowd waiting on the docks. They refuse to allow the ship to unload, and the ship simply turns around and goes back to Britain. The same thing happens in Philadelphia. There's a ship that's turned back there as well. In Charleston, South Carolina, a group of colonists are also waiting on the docks there. Instead of turning back the ship, they actually unload the tea, they lock it up in a warehouse, and they leave it there until it rots. And then there's Boston. And I think we all know what happens in Boston. In late November and early December 1773, 3 East India ships arrive in Boston Harbor. They're loaded down with tea. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, they decide that they are going to stand guard at the dock to make sure that nobody tries to unload the tea. The governor of Massachusetts, a man by the name of Thomas Hutchinson, refuses to allow the ships to leave before they're unloaded. So the captains of these ships are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do we try to unload the tea and risk being attacked by a riot? Or do we try to go back to Britain and risk being arrested by the British Navy? Well, the Sons of Liberty come up with a plan. On the night of December 16th, 1773, about 50 of them disguised themselves as Native Americans. They smear coal dust on their faces, they put feathers in their hair, and they're not really trying to pass themselves off as Native Americans. They simply want to hide their identities. It's kind of hard to tell who you are if you've got coal dust smeared all over your face. They go down to Griffin's Wharf, they board the 3 ships, and they dump all 342 chests of tea in the Boston Harbor. It's so much tea that the entire process takes around 3 hours. Now, this has sometimes been described as a riot, and at other times described as an act of civil disobedience. And if you don't remember what civil disobedience is, that's essentially a peaceful protest in which you refuse to follow a law. Like you essentially protest a law by not following it, but you do it in a peaceful manner. Now, this definitely was not a riot. They actually set rules before they boarded the ships. They agreed that they wouldn't steal anything. They agreed that they would not damage or destroy the ships. The only property they would destroy was the tea. And they stuck to these rules very closely. One man was caught trying to stuff tea into his pockets, and they subsequently ripped off his coat and threw his coat overboard. When all the tea had been poured, they swept the decks, and the only damage they caused, other than the tea, was a padlock. They had accidentally broken a lock trying to get into the holds of one of these ships. And the next day, a few of the protesters actually returned and replaced the lock. Now, the problem with calling this an act of civil disobedience is the fact that they did destroy the tea. In fact, they destroyed around $1.5 million in today's money in tea. So, in reality, it's probably safe to say that the Boston Tea Party was somewhere in the middle. It was probably closer to an act of civil disobedience than it was to a riot. On the right here, you see a tea chest that is on display in Boston to this day. And it is actually the only known tea chest that still exists that we know was thrown into Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party. It takes about 6 weeks, but news of the Boston Tea Party arrives in London in early January 1774. And as you can imagine, both King George and Parliament were not so happy to hear the news. And Parliament responded by passing a series of laws that were meant to punish the colony of Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. The first law was known as the Boston Port Act, and it effectively closed Boston Harbor. Now, think about the economy of New England. Their economy is based on shipbuilding, fishing, whaling. They're very sea-based. So imagine how many people lost their jobs because Boston Harbor was closed. And the bill stated that the harbor would stay closed until the tea that was destroyed was paid for. The Massachusetts colonial legislature was dissolved. Now, remember, a legislature is a group of lawmakers. So, London has basically taken away the right for the colony of Massachusetts to govern itself. There is a bill known as the Administration of Justice Act. And what this law does is it allows for British officials to be taken to England for trial. So if you're a British soldier and you get into a bar fight and kill a colonist, you can be taken to Britain for trial. Now imagine how that trial is going to end. You're going to get a slap on the wrist. They might fine you some money, and that's about it. So this is upsetting to the colonists because it's allowing British soldiers to get away with crimes maybe as heinous as rape or murder. And then there is the Quartering Act. Now this law states that around 3,000 British troops will be sent back to Boston, and the people of Boston have to give them a place to live. If they refuse to do that, then the soldiers are able to actually basically shack up with the people of Boston in their houses. And of course, this is something that makes the people of Boston extremely angry. And they refer to these laws as the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable, of course, means it is unacceptable. Now, the other colonies are very distressed by the Coercive Acts. By the way, coercive means to force or bully. So the fact that this law even exists, that there's even a law out there called the Coercive Acts, really shows that the British government has crossed the line. They've gone a little too far. And many colonists are afraid that if this can happen to Massachusetts, this can happen to the other colonies. So in September of 1774, there is a meeting that takes place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the point of this meeting is to discuss how they're going to respond to the Intolerable Acts. 12 of the 13 colonies send delegates. Georgia, for some reason, doesn't send anyone. And they decide that, one, they're going to send a petition to King George asking Parliament to repeal the Intolerable Acts. Two, they're going to once again boycott all British goods. This has worked in the past, should work again in the future. And finally, they recommend that the colonies begin training their militias and collecting as many weapons and as much ammunition as possible. This is basically Plan B, just in case they are unable to avoid war with Great Britain.